Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 25, The Long 7th Century, Part 6, Armageddon. Last time, we talked about Josiah's portrayal primarily in the Book of Kings as a violent cultic reformer, something that may have a basis in reality, but was likely blown way out of proportion by theologically inclined writers. He's cast as the king who got rid of all worship of Baal, of Asherah, and of frankly anything outside of the capital city. Whether he had much success in his apparent attempt to centralize all worship in Jerusalem during this time period is almost irrelevant, because, well, he died before any of it could stick. Far more important than the specifics of his failed attempt at cult reform is the legacy of this supposed centralization, as later Yahweh saw Josiah as the pinnacle of faithfulness to their God, and the overwhelming majority of other kings of Israel and Judah were instead cast as apostates that followed strange foreign gods and heretical practices. But not Josiah. Josiah was God's perfect king, the kind of figure that might have been portrayed as a divine king in the manner that some of the Psalms talk about. You, the king, are my, God's son, whom I have begotten. But he never achieved that status. Today, we'll be talking about Josiah falling flat on his face, some of the immediate aftermath in the political sphere of his failure, and the fallout of this attempt at centralizing all worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem. Writers and prophets like Jeremiah will scream that Josiah was not wrong, that he wasn't to blame, but that it was the people and the kings and the elites who had failed Yahweh, not the other way around. And none of it, especially, is at all Josiah's fault. While I won't blame the entire fall of Judah on Josiah, his probably avoidable death certainly won't help things. Everything changes when Josiah marches to Megiddo. The ruins of Megiddo, known for centuries as Tel el-Mutasalim, lie at the southwest end of the sprawling Jezreel Valley. The town's name is so old that its meaning is likely lost to time, as Megiddo was first inhabited at least 9,000 years ago, and it remained important for millennia, with good reason. As I've mentioned a few times on the show, Jerusalem is in the hilly Judean highlands to the southeast, and Samaria lies north of Jerusalem in a similar surrounding environment. Megiddo, on the other hand, was a bit west, closer to the Mediterranean, sitting at the north end of Wadi Ara, a river valley that runs parallel to the coast and cuts through difficult and mountainous terrain. Even today, there's a highway that takes advantage of this shortcut. The great trade routes that allowed kingdoms to flourish carried all kinds of goods from Egypt in the south through Megiddo, northward to the Phoenician coast in Damascus, and from there to Anatolia and the northern Fertile Crescent and beyond. Without the narrow pass, one would have to take lengthy detours or slowly crawl over hard terrain, something not so easy with animals and carts. So Megiddo became a critical choke point on the road during the Bronze Age, acting as the site for several battles between warring polities, and eventually lending our otherwise out-of-the-way Kingdom of Israel a strategic toll booth and a minor economic center like many towns on the Great Roads, where weary travelers stopped for a beer and a meal. A late Bronze Age copy of Gilgamesh was found there, the part where Enkidu comes to terms with his impending death. It was that hoppin' of an international trade zone. But that importance put a bit of a target on their back. I mean, it was important enough that it was attacked by the oldest confirmed historical character in the Hebrew Bible, Pharaoh Shoshenq I, known in 1 Kings as Shishak. The Omrides, maybe Ahab himself, had fortified the town and built up its walls, giving Samaria's northern kingdom, fading from memory by Josiah's time, a source of taxation and state assertion. After Israel's destruction, however, the city became the Assyrian outpost of Megiddo. Up until this point in history, Megiddo was on track to be a Damascus or a Tyre, cities with long and storied histories, ups and downs, deep history, but not necessarily cultically important outside of its immediate region. This wasn't Jerusalem or Babylon or Mecca. It was a trade town. All of that changes in today's episode as the great King Josiah makes his ill-advised stand in an apparent ploy to assert regional political authority and faces swift consequences for his troubles. Megiddo, after this time, after Josiah's consequential decision, will become a city instead associated with failure, triumph, and eventually, nothing less than the end of the world and the gore-strewn inauguration of God's divine kingdom. As we explore the end of Josiah's reign and its consequences today, we'll also bid a final farewell to Assyria, and I'll give the magnificent First Empire of the world a proper send-off, as we explore its legacy and usher in the Neo-Babylonian Empire in its place. In fact, some of Assyria's magnificent engineering may have been reassigned by later writers to Babylon itself, as one of the most famous structures in all of history may have been moved from Nineveh to Babylon in the popular imagination. More on that later. I've also got more from my interview with Kipp Davis to bring us through this incredibly formative time, and you can, of course, listen to the entire interview at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast, along with early access to episodes and hours of other bonus content. Sources for this episode include the Oxford History of the Ancient Near East, volumes 4 and 5, and as always, all sources are listed in the bibliography portion of the episode description. When we left Josiah in the narrative of Kings, his scribes had found the book of the law that forbade all worship outside of Jerusalem and had forbidden the worship of gods who weren't Yahweh in the Jerusalem temple. He was riding high, watching with glee as Assyria continued to lose ground in the great regional war. But Egypt was on the move, and they were a serious enough threat that they could potentially challenge the Babylonians, the preferred victors for Jerusalem over the hated Assyrians. If the Assyria-aligned Egyptians secured a claim over the Levant or worse, defeated the Babylonians, it would potentially undo everything Josiah had fought for. A return to heavy taxation and imperial vassalage was unthinkable. Perhaps the Babylonians would offer them a better deal. At least that's one potential reconstruction. It's kind of hard to figure out just why Josiah rode out to Megiddo and what exactly happened there. Kipp and I discussed this fateful trip.
I think as those of us, I'm not technically an historian, but I do a lot of work in history. And those of us who work in history and historians generally, I think on some level you end up latching on to these reconstructions of these figures in our minds as a way to explain what's happening. And this is invariably, I can't help myself from doing this, but I tend to think, like you said, that Josiah probably on some level was a true believer. That, and he had some reason for thinking this too, because the picture that we have available to us seems to suggest, now whether I don't know how much, the thing that keeps coming back to the actual reforms, and there are scholars who don't think that there was any reforms. I tend to think that there was. Again, this is part of the way that I romanticize this sort of stuff, but it's fun, right? If this idea of Josiah's reforms are based in some sort of historical reality, and what this looked like, you know, one of the big parts of this is that they just didn't last. They didn't last at all. Let's say they lasted for the duration of Josiah's administration. And I think if this is something that he implemented, and if in particular something like his incursions into Assyrian territory on the basis of his cultic justification, if that's something that even worked temporarily, then maybe he did think that Yahweh was just going to carry him through to the border of Egypt, or at least to the point of being able to hold on to this incredibly important stronghold at Megiddo. Right. So I don't know. It's the way that the Deuteronomist introduces this story. He just kind of throws it out there, right? Oh, Josiah went to fight Necho at Megiddo and he died. Moving on. Right. I have to think that there is a piece of this, because the goal for the Deuteronomist, right, when it comes to Josiah, he's got this metric through which everything has to be evaluated, whether the kings did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh or what was wicked in the eyes of Yahweh. And for him, the predetermination at this point has to be that Yahweh did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, or sorry, that Josiah did what was right in the eyes of. So with that piece in place, the teller of this tale already has his ending in front of him. And the fact that he ends this story on this note makes me think that this was a plan that went awry.
But something happened then the ring did not intend.
This was why tell the story this way unless Josiah really was on this mission from Yahweh, is kind of the way that I look at this.
And so, for reasons we're left speculating about, Josiah rode out with his military to meet Necho at Megiddo. Megiddo, again, is at the southwest end of the sprawling and agriculturally fertile Jezreel Valley, and this city and region would be written in the Bible as a place of bad omens and great triumphs. Because this area is such a crucial agricultural and strategic area, it's not unlikely that some of these things actually happened, though much of it was mythologized. In his excellent book, Cities That Built the Bible, past Bible Lore podcast guest scholar Bob Cargill notes that the northeast part of the valley is where Saul and his sons die fighting the Philistines, where Deborah is said to command a battle against a Canaanite king. Whatever its former significance, it became an important setting for culturally important stories about the good old days, and sometimes about the future. A lot of this was written into the past by the authors of the Bible both before and after Josiah's mistake, building on the real history of minor glory and the palpable shame and embarrassment of this moment. Megiddo and Jezreel were almost certainly mentioned in early versions of whatever text can be dated before Josiah's time. I mean, it was an important location after all, but this inflection point will become a prism that distorts and transforms how most of the Bible and its reception history understands mentions of Megiddo. All of this despite the terse, matter-of-fact way that the author of Kings spells out Josiah's death. Quote from 2 Kings 23. The other events of Josiah's reign and all his actions are recorded in the annals of the kings of Judah. In his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, marched against the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. King Josiah marched toward him, but when he confronted him at Megiddo, Pharaoh Necho slew him. His servants conveyed his body in a chariot from Megiddo to Jerusalem, and they buried him in his tomb. Kipp is right in that the offhanded and terse mention of Josiah's death at the hands of Necho reads almost like the author was prepared to write something else. And any good study Bible or commentary on Kings will tell you that most of the next two chapters seem tacked on, adding to our confidence that something's fishy here. On the other hand, it's notable that either the author has gotten his facts wrong or a later scribe has screwed up, because careful listeners will note that the passage incorrectly states that the Egyptians were marching up to attack Assyria, when we know from contemporary records that they were actually attacking the Babylonians in support of whatever was left of the Assyrian state at this point. Regardless, this passage was very clearly written to provide just the facts, because this was an embarrassment to the overall story the author was telling. Perhaps, just maybe, this is where the Book of Kings came from, at least parts of it. Josiah's court administrators putting together a big, long narrative with him as the presumed hero who turns Judah into a regional power. But that never happened, and so the ending is just tacked on. The author of Chronicles, lacking a closeness to the humiliation and desiring a better ending, allows Josiah to save some face in his retelling of the story. Quote from 2 Chronicles 35. After all this furbishing of the temple by Josiah, King Necho of Egypt came up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. Necho sent messengers to him, saying, "What have I to do with you, king of Judah? I do not march against you this day, but against the kingdom that wars with me, and it is God's will that I hurry. Refrain then from interfering with God who is with me, that he not destroy you." But Josiah would not let him alone. Instead, he donned his armor to fight him, heedless of Necho's words from the mouth of God, and he came to fight in the plain of Megiddo. Archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, "Get me away from here, for I am badly wounded." His servants carried him out of his chariot and put him in the wagon of his second in command, and conveyed him to Jerusalem. There he died and was buried in the grave of his fathers, and all Judah and Jerusalem went into mourning over Josiah. This author rewrites the story of the Israelites, and for him, Josiah is not a critical pivot point. He's a great king, sure, but he's given one big screw-up to explain his death at the hands of Necho, who's now receiving prophetic oracles from God himself, something that Josiah either ignores or doesn't recognize as being legitimate. It's not exactly well explained. Needless to say, the king's author would have undoubtedly found all of this appalling. But even the chronicler, writing centuries after these events, maybe as late as the Greek period, would not be the last word on Megiddo. Over the years, some influential Jews had become influenced by the Persian Empire and its Zoroastrian cult, who believed that someday there would be a final battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. This idea became prominent within early Judaism, especially as the Judeans came under the thumb of empires that did not remind them of their beloved Persians, but instead the Assyrians and Babylonians, the later Persians, the Greeks, and somehow, worst of them all, the Romans. In the 1st century CE, a small, initially insignificant Jewish offshoot sect became convinced that the world was ending and that their dead leader was returning. One early follower, influenced by reading some of the earlier apocalyptic literature that railed against the Greeks, claimed to have had a vision of the return of Jesus, bearing God's name in his wrath, and he located their glorious divine military entrance at a place called Armageddon, meaning the mountain or mountains of Megiddo. The very battle of the apocalypse will eventually be set here. To this day, there are still those who believe in this eventual eschatological battle, and even the name Armageddon has been transformed into a shorthand for an all-consuming destruction. All of that starts here, with Josiah's undignified death at the hands of Pharaoh Necho II. Despite this failure, this critical miscalculation, Josiah and his reforms, whatever they amounted to, whatever the book of the law looked like at this point, gained a following. One of these Josiah fanboys was the prophet Jeremiah, who was a young man at the time. In the last episode, Kipp mentioned one of the few female prophets in all of the Bible in Huldah, the prophetess who is said to have authorized the divine provenance and legitimacy of whatever book it was the Jerusalem priest Hilkiah presented to Josiah. Keep up with me here. There is some speculation that Jeremiah's father, also named Hilkiah, was this same guy, though many of the biographical details do not match. Hilkiah, father of Jeremiah, was said to be a priest at a different location, decidedly not Jerusalem. If Hilkiah was his father, though, it would explain why the prophet was such a Josiah glazer, as the kids say. Regardless, Jeremiah would not end up living the last decades of his life in Jerusalem, which will be utterly leveled some 2 decades after Josiah's death. Now, we've been through a few rounds of mass deportation and exile in this show, especially those that dealt with the northern kingdom of Israel. And similar exoduses from Judah will be a big part of the fallout in the tumultuous decades after Josiah's death. In the next episodes, I'll go into detail about the last kings of Judah, but for now it'll suffice to say that Jeremiah ended up in Egypt, taken there against his will according to his book, after the final destruction of Jerusalem. The book that bears his name is the longest book in most Bibles, but it didn't start out that way. As I've probably mentioned on this show before, the version of Jeremiah found in all Hebrew Bibles and most Christian Bibles is 17% longer than the version found in the Septuagint, the collection of Greek translations of the books of the Hebrew Bible and a fair few books that fell out of the Jewish canon. On top of that, if you listen to my full interview with Kipp, you can hear him talk about Hebrew manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls that not only confirm that this older version of Jeremiah was originally in Hebrew, but also provides strong evidence that even centuries after these events, this older version of Jeremiah was still undergoing editorial changes and becoming the book that we're all familiar with today. And yet within this, there is likely some smaller chord that goes back to the prophet himself. Whether he wrote some of these rather self-flattering passages himself or not, they portray him as a guy who says he just does not want to be Yahweh's prophet. He doesn't want to tell the Egyptian exiles that they're horrible apostates, but he just has to be God's most annoying scold. In one passage, he claims to have dressed down some of his fellow Yahwists for their impiety to their faces. And it's something that Kipp and I discussed in the context of Josiah's reforms. Here, Kipp reads a passage from his new book, God's Propaganda.
Large numbers of those left behind fled south to Egypt, thinking that they would need some form of protection, some surety to insulate themselves from the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar. They took with them Jeremiah, a Babylonian sympathizer and a friend of the house of Shaphan. He had previously warned them to stay behind in Judah, but this seems like utter folly. Did he expect them to live among the rubble? So here they now found themselves in Taphanas, an Egyptian garrison on the eastern Nile Delta, surrounded mostly by Greek mercenaries. The men gathered together to hear from their unwitting transit companion. He was a prophet after all. Jeremiah was a picture of rage. Yahweh's, his own. At this point, it didn't seem to matter. So says Yahweh Sabaoth, God of Israel. Jeremiah began deep in his throat. You have seen for yourself all the disaster that I brought on Jerusalem and all the towns of Judah. Look at these, a ruin today, and no one inhabits them. That's Jeremiah 44:2. Jeremiah practically spits the words at his audience, but they know that this is an exaggeration. Not everyone is gone. Those unfortunate enough to be unable to make the flight to Egypt remained in the Kidron Valley, in the path of those forces from Babylon, who would certainly soon be upon them. But Jeremiah's speech is not about reality. It's about theology. They know that the idea of an empty land also promotes a sense of divine justice. Jerusalem and its environs enjoys a Sabbath rest as a ritual form of cleansing at the decree of Yahweh. Jeremiah's idea became ingrained in the national ethos of later generations, writing in the Persian province of the Yehud some 200 years later. So Nebuchadnezzar exiled those who survived the sword to Babylon, and the slaves belonging to him. Sorry, I see a typo. And the slaves belonging to him and his sons until the rise of the Persian kingdom, in fulfillment of the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land paid back its Sabbaths. All the days it lay desolate to keep Sabbath until 70 years were completed. So that's 2 Chronicles 36:20-21. But now there would also be a strong shift of focus to a new group of people, the She'erit, the remnant. These were not men who had fled to Taphanas, and they know it. Jeremiah spoke of the wealthy and powerful priests, the aristocrats, and the state officials who were taken to Babylon to be under the watchful eye of Nebuchadnezzar. The rest, the people of the land, as they would come to be known, those who remained in the ruins of Jerusalem and those who fled to Egypt for fear of their own lives, had effectively become disenfranchised by Jeremiah, made invisible, erased. No one inhabits the land. Jeremiah continued in his diatribe, now shouting condemnation at his captors. The towns of Judah are a ruin today, and no one inhabits them because of their wickedness, which they did vex me. To go, make sacrifices, and slave themselves to other gods whom they never knew, neither them nor your fathers. I dispatched to you all my slaves, the prophets, again and again, saying, please do not go to this davar hato'avah, this abominable thing, which I hate. But they did not listen. They did not lend their ear to turn back from their wickedness and did not offer up sacrifices to other gods. So the fury of my anger was poured out, and it blazed in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. These became a wasteland, uninhabitable until this day. Now, so says Yahweh, God of Sabaoth, God of Israel, why are you doing such immense harm to your own lives? To exterminate yourselves, man and woman, child and infant, from the center of Judah to the point that no She'erit, no remnant is left among you. To infuriate me by the works of your hands, to make sacrifices to other gods in the land of Egypt where you have come to settle. In so doing, you exterminate yourselves. You have become a curse and a laughingstock among all the nations on earth. Have you forgotten the wickedness of your fathers, the wickedness of the kings of Judah, the wickedness of their women? Your own wickedness, the wickedness of your women, what they did in the land of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. To this day have they not been crushed. They do not fear, nor do they walk in my Torah and hukatai, my instructions, which I set before you and your fathers. That's Jeremiah 44, 2-10. Jeremiah screams like an enraged, wounded animal. What could these refugees have done to him find such scathing rebuke, especially for a decision made to protect their own families? The accusation settles on this violation. These people, singling out the women among them, have flaunted their independence. They have failed to submit to the Torah of Yahweh along with the instructions. By the time that Nehemiah invoked these words centuries later, these texts are thought to be specific parts of what became the Hebrew Bible. Even in the time of Jeremiah, could these have been some form of Deuteronomy or the Book of the Covenant in Exodus 21-23? The men slouch and they hide their eyes while Jeremiah blasts away. And he continues, to be sure, this is what Yahweh Tsabaoth, God of Israel, has said. Look here, I am setting my face to catastrophe, to exterminate all of Judah. And I will take the She'erit, the remnant of Judah, who set their face to enter the land of Egypt in order to settle there. But they shall be consumed, all who are in the land of Egypt. They shall fall by the sword. They shall be consumed by hunger, from the least to the greatest. By sword and by hunger they shall die. So these people shall become a horror, a curse, a laughing stock. So I shall visit upon the residents in the land of Egypt, just like I visited upon Jerusalem with sword, with hunger, and pestilence. There will be no survivor, no one spared of the She'erit, the remnant of Judah who came to settle in this place. The land of Egypt shall be left to return to the land of Judah. Their very being pines to return, to live there, but they will not go back, save perhaps for a handful. It's Jeremiah 44, verses 11-15. The humiliating dressing down is not something that these men expected. Surely the prophet understood that they were trying to protect their own families. Did he really think that they would remain behind in the ruins of the demolished city, in the countryside, ravaged by the mobilization of thousands of Babylonian troops? The subtly singling out of the women in their company seemed especially uncalled for, so they responded to Jeremiah. All those men who knew that their women made sacrifices to other gods, and all the women who were standing there, a great company, and all the people who had settled in Egypt, in Taphanes, they said, the word which you are speaking to us in the name of Yahweh? No, we will not listen to you. On the contrary, we shall keep doing everything we have said to make sacrifices to Meleket Hashemayim, the queen of the sky, and pour out her libations just as we have always done. We, our fathers, our kings and leaders in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem, when we had our fill of bread and things were good and we saw nothing bad. But ever since we stopped making offerings to Meleket Hashemayim, that's the queen of the heavens, the queen of the sky, and pouring out for her libations, we have been devoid of everything. Sword and famine consume us. That's verses 16-18. These men were nothing if not pragmatic. The efficacy of their religious activities can be judged on the results. They have always worshipped the queen of the sky, Asherah. And in all that time, things were good. They had plenty to eat. They lived peaceably and out of danger. It was not until someone convinced them that their devotion to Asherah was a problem that disaster overtook Jerusalem. I'm reminded of how this concern for the protection from harm connects to the religious observance of the especially careful fellow Job, but that's from another chapter. This claim also seems better to describe the social political situation in Judah leading up to Josiah's religious reforms in 622 BCE and the subsequent decline of the kingdom following his death up to the calamity in 586 BCE. As noted in a previous chapter, the 8th century BCE king Jerusalem King Manasseh and his policy of accommodation and cooperation with the Assyrians and Judah's neighbors resulted in nearly a century free from invasion and conflict, maybe characterized as a period of relative prosperity and one in which religious dynamism flourished, as seen in the prolific presence of Asherah in the archaeological record. Is it any wonder that the people responded to Jeremiah as they did? Why should he single out the women and the long-cherished popular cults of Asherah for blame when the catastrophe they had just endured seemed to coincide with the draconian policies of the Yahweh alone groupies like this prophet of Cope?
And that passage corresponds with archaeology. Whatever Josiah's reforms amounted to, they did not take. We are privy to very few voices from the history of the Israelite and Judahite people. The only voices preserved in their own words were either written by or filtered through those who followed in Josiah's footsteps in his centralization and in his veneration of Yahweh alone. There are glimpses available to us into this former diversity of views on Yahweh, and outside of a few places, they are almost always condemned, portrayed as wicked and heretical. And even in Jeremiah's presentation of his enemies in Egypt, we can just barely see their views, only from the perspective of someone who disagrees with them. To me, these women and men who have earned Jeremiah's ire had a point. Josiah had promised the people that dedication to Yahweh alone in Jerusalem alone would be the key to their success. And according to Kings, he had even terrorized the altars and homes of his fellow Yahwists in order to achieve the support of his God. And what did that gain him? He ended up unceremoniously killed for his troubles at Megiddo, another victim of the larger empires, and in the subsequent scrabble, Judah was turned into rubble. This wasn't all Josiah's fault, but whatever his reasons, his glorious mistake had certainly put a target on Jerusalem's back. And Babylon was coming. Egypt, once again, would struggle to hold on to the Levant. The remnants of Assyria were not destined to make a last-minute comeback. They are just falling out of existence. So before we leave Assyria in the dust, we should give them a proper farewell. Babylon, in many ways, became Assyria. Their lengthy campaign against Nineveh did not require much prodding to gain support. The people of the Middle East had grown tired of Assyria after over a century of brutal imperial rule, reaching its apex in the reign of the violent Ashurbanipal. The first king of this new Babylonian dynasty, Nabopolassar, had to fight the beast of empire for over a decade, and that would have crushed any memories of high-minded rhetoric or justified anti-imperial logic that the revolt may have initially represented. Any idea of liberation and self-rule was going to take a backseat to practicality. The goal was to get things running again. They needed a stable political situation to truly declare the war and fighting over. Jerusalem didn't play ball, as we'll see, and they end up repeatedly butting heads with the new emperor's son and successor, the infamous Nebuchadnezzar, destroyer of Jerusalem. Despite Assyria's fall and Josiah's blunder being the real beginning of the end, and despite the prophet Nahum's joyous proclamations that we went over last time, Nineveh will not be primarily blamed for Judah's downfall. From an internal view, the king's author will blame Manasseh, but the real big bad of Jewish and then Christian memory will be their successors, Babylon. Assyria becomes the subject of what seems to be a dark comedy or even satire in the Bible, the book of Jonah, the prophet sent by Yahweh to save Nineveh, much to his frustration. Despite pressing Israel and then Judah into vassalage, destroying Israel multiple times in the 8th century, and then bringing Jerusalem to its knees during Hezekiah's reign and Sennacherib's invasion, Assyria is not often viewed with such vitriol in popular culture. Babylon is the big villain, and they serve as the archetype for Rome. A similar shift from Assyria to Babylon happened in Greek culture as well, though in this case it was some of Assyria's splendor, rather than its infamy, that was saddled onto Babylon. The scholar Stephanie Dawley has written a fascinating book called The Mystery of the Hanging Garden of Babylon, in which she notes that this most elusive of world wonders, the magnificent garden suspended above ground level, has often mystified scholars and historians. It starts centuries later, around Alexander the Great's conquests, when discussions of the splendor of the Hanging Gardens begin. Lists of the world's wonders discussed by Greek and later Roman authors began to appear, changing depending on the time and the writer's interests. All told, Wikipedia tracks over 20 different ancient seven wonders across 18 different lists from the olden days. Some of these, like the pyramids of Giza, were incredibly ancient by the time the list began circulating, while others, like the Lighthouse of Alexandria, were relative newcomers on the scene, just recently built. Still others, like the Colossus of Rhodes, would grow in fame and stature beyond their origins. What was originally a big statue became a statue so large that its legs spanned the harbor in the popular imagination by the Middle Ages. But many of these were accessible, at least in locale, to Mediterranean tourists and travelers in antiquity, either as real buildings or as ruins. But there's one problem with the Hanging Gardens. In the ruins of Babylon, there just isn't a good candidate for where these gardens would be based on the descriptions provided to us by the most ancient authors, and even more, how water would get onto the elevated structure. Babylon lay far south in the marshy flatlands of southern Mesopotamia. The citadel doesn't seem to have had room for this garden structure, and unlike our other wonders, it was so far inland that it's unlikely that any of these writers actually visited the city. This has led to some speculation that they may never have existed in the first place, but Daly makes a fascinating case that what is instead going on is a mix-up of Nineveh and Babylon. The Assyrians, you'll recall, constantly portrayed themselves as the new Babylon, even as they constantly warred against the very real city of Babylon in a relationship similar to Roman veneration of ancient Greece. And there are good reasons to think that this mix-up might have led to our name confusion. Sennacherib, Ashurbanipal's grandfather who brought Judah to the brink, makes a boast that might give us a plausible record for when the gardens were built. Quote from Daly's translation of the Sennacherib Prism, a text written to honor the emperor and note his achievements. Whereas in former times, the kings my forefathers had created bronze statues, imitating real-life forms to put on display inside temples, but in their method of work, they had exhausted all the craftsmen for lack of skill and failure to understand the principles. They needed so much oil, wax, and tallow for the work they caused a shortage in their own countries. I, Sennacherib, leader of all princes, knowledgeable in all kinds of work, took much advice and deep thought over doing that kind of work. I created clay molds as if by divine intelligence for something called tall tree trunks, and also something called palm trees, tree of riches, in order to draw water up all day long. I had ropes, bronze wire, and bronze chains made, and instead of a shadoof, I set up the cylinders and screws of copper over cisterns. I made those pavilions look just right. I raised the height of the surroundings of the palace to be a wonder for all peoples. I gave it the name Incomparable Palace, a high garden imitating the Amanus Mountains I laid out next to it, with all kinds of aromatic plants, orchard fruit trees, trees that enrich not only mountain country but also Chaldea, as well as trees that bear wool planted within it. So there's a lot going on there. Daly believes that the references to palm trees and tree trunks are referring to large cast bronze cylinders that would have functioned as an Archimedes screw. Sennacherib's scribe states that previous attempts to cast large bronze figures ran into technological and resource limitations, but his own craftsmen had developed a new technique requiring fewer resources that allowed larger cast bronze. Regardless of whether Daly is right about the curved palm tree being a reference to a screw, it's clear that this passage is describing a new water-raising technique to replace the shadoof, which is a fairly simple lever and bucket system. And it even describes this technology being deployed to raise water to a garden which is then described as a wonder. The gardens would have been truly impressive, raised high above the city, and featuring a curated selection of trees and plants designed to evoke surrounding ecologies. In fact, when the Elamites and Chaldean Babylonians attacked the city in Josiah's time, one of their options for breaching the city's enormous and lengthy walls was the Garden Gate, an entryway named for this impressive achievement on the citadel. And yet it would be Babylon, not Nineveh, who would be credited for this marvel. And that's one of the most interesting parts of Assyria's legacy. They were the first empire. They had impressive achievements in engineering and mathematics and literature, and so much more that we're not privy to due to accidents of history. The Romans and Greeks were preserved in the historical record due to the center of power having a fairly direct line in terms of language and culture for many, many centuries. and their views on the Middle East and the Mesopotamians became the received wisdom, no matter how Orientalist or incomplete the picture was. Because of this, it's not just the Bible or the Greeks or the Romans who get a distorted view of Assyria's history. It's us in the modern Western world who often miss the mark. Here's a bit from Daly's book, quote, "It is often thought that concrete was not developed until the Roman period. As recently expressed, quote, one of the most renowned of the Roman contributions to building technology was the development of concrete, end quote. It is lucky for our understanding of Assyrian technology that the archaeologist Seton Lloyd, who explored the Assyrian ruins at Jirwan, was an architect by training. On finding what he thought was Assyrian concrete at Jirwan, he submitted samples for analysis to the British Building Research Station's Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, who reported that the samples consisted of a mix made up of magnesian limestone aggregate and muddy river sand, cemented by a magnesian lime made by burning a magnesian limestone. He included the full analysis in his detailed report of 1935. Now, the book she quotes from at the beginning of that paragraph is 2008's Oxford Handbook of Engineering and Technology, which is hardly the place you'd expect to see someone miss the mark by centuries. But that is how Assyria is commonly thought of or not thought of in the popular imagination. Leftist philosophers like Alan Woods and Bertrand Russell do Assyria pretty dirty in their histories of ancient philosophy, brushing them aside and somewhat devaluing the sophistication of their society and its connection to later Greek and Roman intellectual achievements. One of past guest Eckart Fromm's key arguments in his history of Assyria is that this is not just where the Bible begins, but also concepts and traditions that would get folded into the idea of the quote-unquote West, capital W, and that includes Orientalism, and it primarily starts with perceptions of the ancient Middle East that, despite all of the changes and improvements in our analytical abilities, still have purchase today and color the way most people understand the peoples and societies of the Middle East from antiquity down to today. I think Assyria deserves to be reckoned with as a serious empire and an interesting people with all of the nuance that entails. Their bloody expansionism and the century of Babylonian humiliation proved to be their undoing, and in an ironic twist of fate, an empire that had molded itself so specifically after the ancient Babylon of Hammurabi had been conquered by Hammurabi's own spiritual successor, Nabopolassar, a king who, like the ancient lawgiver, had destroyed a kingdom centered on Ashur's legend, the inheritors of the legacy of the obscure Kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia that I discussed in our very first episode. It would be like an Athenian conqueror overthrew the Romans in the 4th century. It's got that kind of historical poetry to it. The Neo-Assyrians should be seen as the villains of the Bible in a much larger way than they are. And their achievements can't be ignored either in mathematics and bureaucratic stability and construction and everything else we've seen. But the reception among their Western neighbors and their reputation as foreign, capital O, others in the Bible and in Greek history would sow the seeds for the Orientalism that Edward Said eventually contended with in the latter half of the 20th century. Shamuramat, the great queen of 9th century Assyria who kept the Israelite King Jehu's successors under her thumb, became the curiosity of Semiramis, eventually cast as sexually voracious to the point that it got her killed. And this probably happened with the help of Nicaea, Ashurbanipal's grandmother, Sennacherib's wife, who styled herself after the powerful queen. She referred to herself as a new Shamuramat in inscriptions, and, as a powerful queen mother herself, oversaw the loyalty oaths and ensured her son Esarhaddon's screwy succession path had a hefty royal weight and put Ashurbanipal on the throne. All of this gets twisted in the maw of civilizational conflict and fear of the capital O other. Ashurbanipal himself became the debauched Sardanapalus, a symbol of royal avarice and indolence and general excess. In A Tale of Two Cities, before his rather negative assessment of the excesses of the French Revolution, Dickens provides a poisoned eulogy for the ancien regime as well. Quote, "The shining bullseye of the court was gone, or it would have been the mark for a hurricane of national bullets. It had never been a good eye to see with, had long had the mote in it of Lucifer's pride, Sardanapalis's luxury, and a mole's blindness, but it had dropped out and was gone. The court, from that exclusive inner circle to its outermost rotten ring of intrigue, corruption, and dissimulation, was all gone together. Royalty was gone, had been besieged in its palace and suspended when the last tidings came over." Side note, it feels great to say ancien regime. Anyway, this comparison is not exactly unfair. Ashurbanipal was a big part of the reason Assyria disintegrated, even if the details of the Sardanapalus tales only contain echoes of the real guy and frankly downplay the cruelty he was known for at the time. The Assyria that had destroyed most of Israel and Judah was replaced by the arch-villain of Babylon in the minds of the authors and readers of the biblical texts. There's a reason that in Revelation, Rome is the new Babylon, not the new Nineveh. And yet, outside of some mythologized history of the king's narrative where Assyria pops up on occasion, there exists only a lightly coded acknowledgement of Assyria's overpowering achievement in political hegemony. Let me explain. Some of the most notorious parts of the Bible for readers are its genealogies, and for good reason.
Hi, I'm Larry King. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form. Begat Phineas. Phineas begat Abushua. And Abushua... Shalom begat Hilkiah. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. Well, that's it. My old friend Duke Zeva's standing by. We'll get some coffee. We'll get some matzo ball soup.
And yeah, they're an absolute chore to read as literature. Take Genesis 10, which we've briefly discussed before, though I can't remember in which episode. This is what's referred to as the Table of Nations, where the author traces all the peoples and kingdoms he was aware of back to Noah's sons, stretching from Ukraine down to Sudan. Depending on what the author was aware of about their culture, he would give their founding figures some role that mirrors the reality on the ground. And many of these traditions seem firmly dated to the Iron Age, despite allegedly being set thousands of years before. Quote, "And the sons of Ham, Cush and Mizraim, and Put and Canaan. And the sons of Cush, Seba and Havilah and Reamah and Sabteca. And the sons of Reamah, Sheba and Dedan. And Cush begot Nimrod. He was the first mighty man on earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Therefore is it said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. The start of his kingdom was Babylon and Erech and Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. From that land Ashur emerged, and he built Nineveh and Rehoboth-ir and Calah and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, which is the great city." Robert Alter's commentary on the passage notes that Nimrod might be a reference to Tukulti-Ninurta I, a 13th century Assyrian king who defeated the Babylonians. Here he may be recast as Nimrod, an otherwise obscure figure who seems to have been a known and legendary king to whoever wrote the passage in Genesis 10. Now, whatever Sardanapalus-like legends that were written about him in the early Iron Age are either buried in the sand or gone forever. Here he's credited, like Marduk before him, with founding the city of Babylon, and a figure named Ashur, associated indirectly with him, leaves Babylon to found other famous cities and capitals like Nineveh and Calah, known among its population as Kalhu, which will later be renamed Nimrud in honor of our boy Nimrod. Of course, we know that Babylon was a little old ancient city that first reached prominence under Hammurabi, but the author of Genesis didn't know that. He was working with his own traditions in his own time, and so Assyria, which seems to have lasted forever, became the grand royal hunter and the founder of the very idea of empires, which, in a way, they kind of were. These pictures aren't completely wrong, they're just distorted. Shamauramat may not have been sexually voracious, but she really did campaign as a powerful military conqueror. Ashurbanipal really did screw things up in a way that subsequent kings couldn't fix, even if he wasn't the last king of Assyria. Assyria really was the first true empire the world had seen, and its kings did portray themselves as great hunters of lions, even if all of this didn't stretch back thousands of years like Genesis 10 states. And Babylon, not Assyria, really did end up being the kingdom that eventually crushed Judah with a pronounced finality. What we're going to see over the next couple episodes is a catastrophe in the Levant that will cast a long shadow over the rest of Western history. Assyria was gone. The war was mostly over, but Judah's calamity had only just begun. Josiah, the king who was supposed to fix everything, the one who may have commissioned the writing of Deuteronomy, the model of everything righteous and pious and good to a burgeoning sect of Yahweh worshippers, was dead. He ruled for around 30 years, but probably never saw his 40th birthday. The Book of Kings did not get the happy ending the writer hoped for. presumably one where the last decades of Josiah's life would have been spent conquering more land and stamping out more cultic deviancy. Josiah's reign, his death, and the chaos afterward mark the end of what I've dubbed the long 7th century, the period of Assyria's impressive rise and fall, from Tiglath-Pileser III down to the obscure pretenders who followed in Ashurbanipal's wake. Jerusalem's destruction is probably the final direct fallout of the world war that Nabopolassar's Babylon definitively won, but in many ways the response to this entire period has indirectly colored the rest of Western history through its eventual reception among Christians, the apocalyptic sect that eventually would become the empire and bring new meaning to Megiddo. Next time on the Bible Lore podcast, we speed headfirst out of the long 7th century and into oblivion. Nabopolassar, founder and king of the new Babylonian kingdom, and Josiah, king of Judah, are dead, and their sons Nebuchadnezzar and Jehoahaz will take over in their places. One will last around 40 years on the throne, the other a few short and chaotic months. The old world is dying, as the new one struggles to be born. Special thanks again to Kipp Davis. Make sure to check out his YouTube channel and his new book, God's Propaganda. Both will be linked in the episode description. And if you can, of course, please consider supporting the show by becoming a subscriber at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast, where you can listen to my full interview with Kipp. And if you'd like to buy any of the books referenced in the show, check out the bookshop.org link in the episode description. See you next time.